called Dusk Field, a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were whispered among the trees. It was peaceful, or at least it used to be, until the calls started. In Dusk Field, there was an old folklore, passed down through generations, about the midnight caller. It was said that if you answered a phone call at exactly midnight from an unknown number, a voice would speak to you. No one knew what it said, because no one ever survived to tell. The town treated it like an urban legend, a spooky tale to scare children. But that changed one winter, when the calls returned after nearly 50 years. Chapter 1, The First Call. It started with Jacob Sanders, a grizzled old man who lived on the outskirts of town. He was a retired logger, the kind of man who didn't scare easily, known for being tough and quiet. But on a cold December night, Jacob received a call. It was 11:59 p.m. when his phone rang, the caller ID showing a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he'd let it go to voicemail, but something in him made him pick it up. "Hello?" he said, voice thick with sleep. There was silence on the other end for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as he was about to hang up, he heard it, a faint voice, like a whisper carried by the wind. He couldn't make out the words at first, but the longer he listened, the clearer they became. "We see you." Jacob felt a chill crawl down his spine. He glanced around his dark, empty house, suddenly feeling watched. "What did you say?" he asked, but the line had gone dead. The next morning, Jacob's neighbor found him. The door to his house was wide open, snow blown in across the floor, and Jacob was lying on the ground near the phone. His face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide open, staring at something only he could see. His heart had stopped in the middle of the night, and the coroner could find no cause of death. The town was shaken, but most dismissed it as a tragic coincidence. Chapter 2, The Warnings. A few days later, the calls began again. This time it was young Emily Harper, a high school senior with her whole life ahead of her. She was studying late one night when her phone buzzed, 11:59 p.m. A number she didn't know. Curious, she answered. "Hello?" Again, silence. Then, like a soft hiss, the voice came. "We see you." Emily frowned, feeling unnerved. She hung up quickly and tried to brush it off. But as she returned to her desk, her phone rang again. Same number. This time, she let it ring, but her phone kept buzzing. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Her heart raced as she watched the phone vibrate on her desk, the name unknown flashing over and over. Finally, it stopped. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the phone to turn it off. But before she could, the phone rang again. She jumped, nearly dropping it. It was her mother calling, or so the screen said. Relieved, she answered. "Mom?" But it wasn't her mother's voice on the other end. "We see you." That night, Emily disappeared. Her car was found abandoned on the road to her house, the driver's side door still open. No footprints in the snow. No signs of struggle. Just, gone. The town began to panic. Chapter 3, The Truth. Sheriff Hank Miller had lived in Dusk Field his entire life, and he remembered hearing stories about the midnight caller when he was a kid. But he had never believed it, until now. 2 unexplained deaths in a week. Both receiving strange calls? Something was wrong, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. Desperate, Hank did something he had sworn he would never do. He visited Martha Crane, the town's oldest resident and the keeper of its darkest secrets. Martha was well into her 90s, her eyes clouded with cataracts, her body frail, but her mind was sharp, and she remembered everything. When Hank arrived, Martha was waiting for him. "You're here about the calls," she rasped, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. Hank nodded, uneasy. "You know about them?" Martha gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The midnight caller. It's not a legend, Sheriff. It's real, and it's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Martha's eyes gleamed with something like fear. "It comes for the lonely, the forgotten. It watches from the shadows, waiting for the right time." And once it calls you, there's no escape. Hank shifted in his seat. How do I stop it? You can't, she whispered. Once the call comes, it's already too late. The voice you hear, it belongs to something that isn't human. It calls from beyond the veil, where the dead and the damned linger. What happened 50 years ago, Martha? Why did it stop? Martha's face darkened. The last time it called, the town had a way to fight it. My father was part of it, an old ritual passed down from our ancestors, meant to ward off the spirits that linger in the night, but over time, the knowledge was lost, and with it, our only defense. Now the caller is free to do as it pleases. Hank stood, panic setting in. So what do we do? Wait for it to pick us off one by one? Martha smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's exactly what it will do. Chapter 4, The Last Call. Hank returned home that night, his mind racing. If Martha was right, then the town was doomed. There was nothing he could do but wait for the call. He stayed up all night, his phone on the table in front of him, his hands trembling as the clock inched closer to midnight. 11:58 p.m. The house was dead silent, and Hank could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over the power button. Maybe if he turned it off, it wouldn't come. Maybe if he didn't answer, he'd be safe. 11:59 p.m. The phone rang. Hank's blood ran cold. The screen showed an unknown number. He stared at it, paralyzed with fear. His thumb moved to the button to decline the call, but before he could press it, the ringing stopped. Then, the phone rang again. It wasn't a number this time. It was the word unknown, flashing across the screen. With a deep breath, Hank answered the call. Silence. Then, the whisper. We see you. Hank dropped the phone, his heart racing. He looked around his darkened living room, feeling the oppressive weight of something unseen. The whisper came again, this time closer. We see you. He stumbled back, reaching for his gun, but the lights flickered, and the room seemed to stretch and warp around him. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes, figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They moved closer, surrounding him. The last thing Hank heard before the darkness consumed him was the whispering voice. We see you.